I thought I would just respond to the Foucault t-shirt if I can, because it's interesting that Foucault has been so heavily commodified.
Marx hasn't been commodified. I'm kind of surprised that it came down to that, in that there's an effort to transform a reality while at the same time acknowledging that some of the things we've been talking about, including class, which is surprising to me, isn't real. In fact, it's only relational, as you say. I find that to be very interesting, and it seems to be to actually
I didn't say it
conflict
wasn't
with.
real. I said it wasn't a substance. It is a relation. I mean, that's Marx says it again and again and again. I mean, it's like the basis of capital.
Well, if Marx said it then that must make it true.
No, that's
I was, didn't necessarily want to go down this route, but like just in Montreal, where I'm from and what I consider home, there's a vast anti-carceral movement that is inspired by Foucault.
almost all of the French theorists thought that the Soviet Union was an evil empire led by a dictator.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amounts in the link given in the description box. We rely on you and your support helps us to survive. But without further ado, let me introduce this very special show today. We have with us Professor Gabriel Rockhill and Assistant Professor David Guignion to debate Marxism and postmodernism, post-structuralism. Professor Rockhill is a Marxist philosopher, writer, and cultural critic. He has been absolutely critical of the post-structuralist and postmodern tradition. Assistant Professor Guignion is a philosopher, and his research interest lies in digital media, feminism, critical race theory, and post-structuralism. As far as I know, he is extremely sympathetic to the postmodern, post-structuralist traditions, and we will see what his thoughts are on Marxism. Both Professor Rockhill and Professor Guignion also have their excellent YouTube channels, the link to which we would be giving in the description box. Please check them out and support. So, we are debating today the strengths and weaknesses of Marxism and that of post-structuralism, postmodernism. Before we start, I want to say that any kind of interventions, interjections are welcome until that situation reaches to the level of Indian primetime television debates, in which point, out of shame, I will have to intervene, but I don't expect, knowing both David and Professor Rogill, I don't expect any of them to reach that stage. So, David, if we could start with you, why don't you give us your how you look at the corpus of the work, which is most often labeled as post-structuralist, postmodernist. If you can discuss some names, some works very briefly, just so that people have a sense of what we are talking about. And please tell us, why do you think this constitutes a radical tradition?
Well, yeah, thanks for having me on, Jyotish, and thanks. Greetings to everybody, all the listeners of India and the Global Left. I mean, I wasn't familiar with your channel until you reached out, and I've since had a great old time getting caught up with everything that you've been doing, which is great. It's really great stuff. Yeah, I mean, the postmodernism and the post-structuralist idea is for me something I've never really subscribed to, which might itself be something that we can unpack a little bit. But at least understanding this French theory tradition as one homogeneous mass of thinkers is something I've kind of resisted more or less, partly because, some of the early work that I was interested in was mostly focused on Baudrillard, who was largely, ostracized from that movement. Not to say that Baudrillard is in any way like a radical thinker. So I was just mostly interested in the nitty-gritty distinctions between these thinkers, between Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, Baudrillard, and stuff. And what, I've always struggled with this, applying this kind of identity to this group of people as though they're just all saying the same thing. Now, with that being said, I think that there are obviously some confluences between them. Various considerations about or concerns about Marxism, I think, are really quite common among all of them, and concerns about what they would perceive as fascism or dictatorial regimes in the USSR and stuff, which were clearly poorly thought out and poorly studied. But in any case, I don't think that that is necessarily their only lasting legacy. And radical, I mean, to be totally frank, I don't find them all that particularly radical, given my mostly my concern with American empire these days and thinking through the problems of whatever stage of capitalism we're trying to identify and locate today. But with that being said, I think that they offer a lot of interesting insight into the nature of power, the nature of reality, the nature of language, how these things come to affect us. And where I see some actual, work to be done or some benefit that comes from their work can be found in exactly asking questions that go beyond what we find in, Marx or what comes after Marx. And I think that even after the revolution, if we can even so neatly demarcate a pre and post-revolutionary period, I think that there are many of the things that the post-structuralists were calling attention to that would still be problems, at least with the nature of power, the nature of what subjectivity is, the nature of individualism, that without actually taking these things into account as well in our imagining some post-capitalist futures, I think in part we will risk perpetuating some of the cycles of the past. But I mean, that's my pitch in a nutshell.
Professor Rockhill, if you can respond to that and add why you in particular think that what you have labeled as the theory industry is not just not radical, but is reactionary and counter-revolutionary, and maybe that would trigger a response from David further.
Well, my approach is to always situate the production of ideas within production more generally. And that implies at least two fundamental principles. One is that intellectual production is never done in isolation. It is done in a material system of production. And that therefore, if we want to understand the intellectual production of any individual, Deleuze, Derrida, Lacan, etc., it is imperative on us to situate that individual production within the overall system that produced both the thinker in question and the work that they produced. And the second is that any intellectual production is the result of a theoretical practice, and that we need to analyze that theoretical practice, see how it operates, and what its principal fundamental, what its fundamental goals are. And in the case of French theory, what you have is, if we look at it from a larger historical perspective, is that these thinkers became prominent within the imperial core because it was largely driven by the theory industry that developed within the United States in the wake of World War II. So the fact that people today read Lacan, people like Baudrillard, Derrida, Deleuze, etc., isn't because these people are organically on their own, individually finding these authors and becoming bewildered at how brilliant they are. It's because there's an entire system of intellectual production, distribution, and consumption that has promoted these thinkers as the most important in the world. Given that this system of intellectual production itself is situated within the larger social relations of production, it is necessary then to recognize that this is part of an outgrowth of the broader capitalist system. Given that the US became the leading imperialist power in the wake of World War II, and that it undertook a global war on the principal weapon of theoretical class and practical class struggle on the part of the working masses, namely historical and dialectical materialism, it makes perfect sense to me that French theory and other theories like Western Marxism, Frankfurt School would be an example thereof, and for that matter, many contemporary traditions like new materialism, liberal queer theory, Afro-pessimism, etc., would be promoted by precisely this system. It's promoted, these forms of theory are promoted because they serve an ideological purpose. Otherwise, they wouldn't be. They'd be demoted and sidelined, which is what has been done to dialectical and historical materialism. And I think they've been promoted for very good reason. I mean, we can get into the details of this, but to give you a very quick overview, all of the major French theorists who are well known within the United States, promoted in the United States, and hence through intellectual imperialism internationally, are anti-Marxists. Now, some of them discursively might claim that they are not because they turn Marx into fodder within the bourgeois canon for their own intellectual projects. But when you look at the very nature of their material practice as a theoretical intellectual practice and their orientation within the political world, this becomes crystal clear. In fact, it's not only clear in their overall political orientation, but figures like Jacques Derrida were directly involved in practical anti-communist subversion campaigns in Czechoslovakia. Foucault was involved in the same in Poland, and I'd be happy to unpack the details of both of these cases. And many of the other thinkers were outright supporters of, for instance, settler colonialism and Zionism in the case of Emmanuel Levinas, or in the case of someone like Deleuze. He famously claimed that all revolutions fail and that this was a kind of operative principle that we should all recognize. So they were counter-revolutionary thinkers, and that's precisely why they were so widely celebrated by the US empire, but they were largely marketed as somehow radical, and in fact, radical to such an extent that they surpass the supposed limitations of dialectical and historical materialism. And that's something else I think that would need to be unpacked. There's a kind of superficial discursive radicality that is prominent within what it is that they're doing, but it's lacking in any political teeth because at the end of the day, they are capitalist accommodationist anti-communists.
David.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not as though I disagree with any of that. And I think that this is mostly, I mean, some of I guess my concern would be more of a meta one in that, like, I see that exactly everything that you're saying to be more of a symptom than the cause. And my concern, at least with the work that I'm doing now, not in academia because I'm about to be unemployed, but in other areas, at least in my organizing and working with Yanis Varoufakis's collective in Canada, thinking about post-capitalist futures, I find myself having less and less interest in looking and writing about the symptoms of capitalist exploitation in all of its forms, and instead focusing exclusively on these the capitalist exploitative class and the various the various interests that are upheld by it, be it American imperialism or the media class as being the two big ones I'm interested in. And I think that, like, much of the concern with academia, for me, I think it spawns from, and I'd be curious to know how you think about this, Gabriel, but wondering about the actual role of academics in the revolution. Because for me, as far as like worker struggles go in my own work, people don't really care about the nitty-gritty distinctions between Zizek or Perry Anderson or David Harvey or whomever. And I'm always curious and I'm interested in why it matters, because workers aren't, they don't care. And many of these perspectives are already kind of bound to an ideologically exclusionary rhetorical practice that is, just not going to touch the hearts and minds of the masses of workers, where most of that movement is going to come from them, not from academics, where it feels like maybe you find, and this is what I'm curious about, like, what is the role of the academic in revolutionary praxis? What is the role of the academic in pushing forward towards, post-capitalist futures? Because I'm, kind of unsure about what that role looks like for you.
Well, I think that's an interesting point that you make, because I do think that the majority of workers don't care about, or hopefully don't even read, figures like Deleuze and Lacan. And these are mainly consumer products for the professional managerial class stratum in the imperial core, if you're honest about who's reading these people. And therefore, it begs the question of what this theory is doing at a class level, right? It is theory produced by a particular class for a specific class. And dialectical and historical materialism is not that. Dialectical and historical materialism is attempting to provide a systematic elucidation of material reality so that we can best transform it in a more egalitarian and ecologically sustainable direction. And that has always been the goal of this particular tradition of dialectical and historical materialism. And it operates at different levels, right? So you could also say that most workers are probably not reading the 3 volumes of Marxist Capital. And I think that's probably true. But a lot of Marxist scholarship is deeply, deeply embedded in organic working class struggles because it provides a fundamental framework for understanding how the world works and how to transform it. And so at that level, I think that we see a really crucial divide. And I'd be curious whether or not you'd accept this kind of distinction. And that is that a lot of the theory produced in and by and for the theory industry is driven by exchange value. It's principally selling books for the professional managerial class and the imperial core, whereas dialectical and historical materialism is produced for its use value, meaning that the goal of that theory is to have some use for the general struggle to overcome imperialism and move in the direction of socialism. And so there you have, I think, at the level of theoretical practice, a dividing line that is very fundamental, if you will, because you can't really mix the two of them, or I don't see any coherent manner of doing that. Would you agree with that distinction between theory that has use value for worker struggles versus theory that is principally driven by exchange value within the marketplace of ideas for the kind of consumer segment of the professional managerial class?
Yes. But I mean, why not take it all the way? And this is my gambit where I'm like, there's a lot of contention within even Marxist circles about moving away from French theory, if we're actually engaged with people who self-brand themselves as Marxists and whatnot, clearly there's no consensus among them. And Marxism is not a settled science. And in all of this, though, my gambit is that, like, why do we stop at like French theory? I think that the entire apparatus of academic theoretical production, even at the highest echelons of what maybe you might brand as to being the most accurate Marxist readings of Marx, are themselves a product of this same kind of imperial core production of, carefully setting the limits on what revolutionary praxis looks like. When to be like dialectically materialist would, in a sense, be prepared to accommodate the various kinds of different needs and various kinds of different movements that revolutionary worker struggles are going to take in different contexts. And as soon as we start to apply this kind of universal framework in these ways, I worry that it'll become less about actually accommodating these people's needs and actually transforming at the local and eventually into the global level, a Marxist revolutionary movement, and it will be more the application or the kind of forced adoption of a very specific model, which isn't to say that there aren't, for me, as far as I understand it, there aren't universal attributes of Marxist ideals and its imaginings about post-capitalist futures that would apply everywhere. But I just tend to be a little bit suspicious of this effort to, bemoan the French intellectuals, granted, on the exact same page, and bemoan certain kind of Marxists, when all of this is subtly implying that there actually is a role of, the Western, philosophical, properly Marxist tradition in informing these movements, when the fight against capital has been like taken on different forms and different proportions in different parts of the world and isn't always directly relatable to these founding like documents and doctrine, which I always find to be actually a little bit interesting and a little bit surprising. Marx is the one who, in part, he was the one that liberated the idea of revolutionary praxis from any kind of dogmatic assumptions in offering dialectical materialism. And then I always find it very surprising that, many committed Marxists turn around and then deify Marx, turn him into, the all-seeing, all-knowing person in these movements and what it might look like, which isn't to say it's not valuable. Obviously it is. But in that, I just find some kind of an ironic mirroring of the same kind of thing that even Marx was trying to criticize or to challenge in being properly dialectically materialist and trying to take on the entire breadth of all possible things to know and things to account for when pushing for revolutionary movements, which accounts for so many other things, accounts for the way in which workers as a category is not limited to those engaging in productive, what is deemed to be productive labor, but for example, the entirety of the care economy that mostly falls disproportionately on women's labor that isn't accounted for within the global economic matrix of exploited labor in the most part. Which isn't to say I'm not like, oh, well, Marx didn't talk about XYZ, therefore we should throw Marx out the window. It's just that when moving forward and thinking about the struggles of the past, they've taken on these myriad forms and have accounted for these myriad things in different ways. And I think that that is what is most important, not what is necessarily offered in any kind of like an academically rigorous or strictly academic focal point from which all possible, revolutionary movements can come.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand the dialectical and historical materialist tradition as dogmatic in any way, shape, or form. And the attempt to reduce it even to the term Marxism itself traffics in the same forms of intellectual commodity fetishism that are dominant within the bourgeois forms of knowledge production, meaning that you collapse this very rich, broad international tradition into the supposed genius of an individual thinker who was writing in the 19th century. And Marx himself was fully aware of the fact that he was a man of his times. I mean, that's integral to a dialectical and historical materialist vantage point. And it's that tradition that I think needs to be upheld, not an individual or an individual's group of thoughts or a set of texts that are to be worshipped. All of that, which is largely integral to the Western Marxist approach, not the kind of global Marxist approach, I think is to be soundly criticized. And when you look at the broad and rich Marxist tradition, the analysis of the so-called woman question is absolutely at the core. From Marx and Engels to Lenin to Mao to Vilmé Spin to the list goes on and on and on, Thomas Sankara, etc. And the reason for that is because there's an analysis of how women are situated within the social relations of production and how social reproductive labor is a fundamental aspect of how capital functions, or it has functioned at least historically. And therefore, there's a need to keep women in a particular role within, as what Lenin referred to as domestic slaves, in order to have unpaid labor that reproduces the worker day in and day out. And so there are often these straw person versions of dialectical and historical materialism that present it as, for instance, being dogmatic or not taking into account the woman question, or another one that I love is not taking into account the racial question. There's this great line by Walter Rodney where he says, people say that Marxism is Eurocentric and just for white guys and all of this. If you understand history, which most philosophers and intellectuals who are trained in philosophy don't understand history because they don't study it. He said, well, if Marxism had a color, it'd be yellow, because it's mainly been in the East that you have Marxism in actually existing form through socialist state building projects. It certainly wouldn't be white. And so what he's recognizing there is that what people call Marxism, or what I would prefer to call dialectical and historical materialism, is a living tradition that has taken on many, many different forms, had very rich internal debates, but yes, at the same time is coherent. And I'm one of those who defends science. I think it's one of the most important things that we have, meaning at a very general level, the ability to distinguish truth claims from claims that aren't true based on empirical verification and a kind of rigorous scientific method. And by science, I don't mean some type of positivist straw person where, I can, as an individual, perfectly apprehend every aspect of reality as if I had a God's eye point of view. But I do think that what dialectical and historical materialism strives for, and what it continues to do, is it develops a scientific apprehension of reality whose explanatory power and transformative power surpasses that of any other form that we have. Bourgeois social science doesn't do it. That's for sure. The bourgeois humanities are, basically spend all of their time praising superstition. And so in that regard, I think that the best way of understanding dialectical and historical materialism is a rich collective international tradition that is oriented toward the most rigorous apprehension of material reality. And I think, quite frankly, they've proven within that tradition, the members of this tradition have proven that they've been able to both theoretically and practically move in a direction that demonstrates the superiority. And we could point to a number of examples of that. For instance, almost all of the French theorists thought that the Soviet Union was an evil empire led by a dictator. It doesn't take a genius. In fact, the Central Intelligence Agency has internal documents where they clearly state that Stalin wasn't a dictator because the form of rule in the Soviet Union wasn't a dictatorship. Right. So what that means is that the French theorists basically believed imperialist propaganda and a false image of what the Soviet Union was. And now I think we, have enough documented proof to make the claim that they were incorrect about that. And there are many other examples that could be pointed to.
Yes, I mean, just, to go through these things one by one. Obviously, dialectical materialism is not dogmatic. Clearly not. It has less to do with that, and what I'm concerned with is more the way in which dialectical materialism is reserved for Marx, and specifically kind of located in Marx. When, if we are to believe Marx, he is describing something that antedates himself and predates himself, given that the exact class struggles that he's referring to have been there long before he was around. And part of my, this is not anything that I take in any amount of like seriousness in academic or actual my in praxis, but I'm always like really curious about what the point of Marx was, given that if these things are indeed inevitable, if indeed capitalism is going to sow its own ends, why do we need Marx? And part of this for me has less to do with like what Marx necessarily offers and more what Marx represents. And I think that there's something within this idea, and I mean, I have my Foucault shirt on. I don't know if you can see. He looks like Nosferatu, my Foucault shirt. But one of the things one of Foucault's points that I really like is his writings on authorship and the ideas about authors and the way in which we tend to offer this idea of authors as people who have somehow, some way broken through the boundaries of what is epistemically permissible and have offered something that is wholeheartedly new on the world stage. And I'm not saying that Marx believed that of himself. I think that Marx saw himself on a trajectory that was very much in line with what was coming before him and what he was responding to. He was, obviously David Ricardo and Adam Smith and Proudhon and others. Of course, he was making these kinds of interesting interventions. But even in going beyond that and moving forward through it in history, my concern is not with whether dialectical materialism is something that Marx is diagnosing and understanding as being a fundamental product of social change in the world, or as being one of the motivating factors for it. It's that whenever we then cite this or think through this, it's always with this kind of one eye still geared towards and pointed towards Marx as being either the person that set this moving or having properly identified it. And in doing so, it places a kind of anchor in what these movements can look like, at least for me. And in doing so, and this isn't even to say that it's like, oh, it's just representing a kind of Eurocentric framework. Does Marx naively deploy this idea of the human? How does Marx justify, his own views of colonialism in India? Is he just then, another extension of European empire in these cases? Is he not part of the imperial core when he says that, the colonialism of India, yeah, it was bad, but at least it's going to, liberate Indians from their traditions and bring them into the spectral light of, the capitalist economy or anything like that. Like, it's in those ways that I think that Marx is definitely not above reproach, and Marx needs to be criticized. And I think that part of the project, and at least how I've been thinking about it recently and trying to actually schematize like post-capitalist futures and putting it to collective action, is to do so without necessarily pointing to anything academic. Because I think that the entirety of even like the academic, the intelligentsia class is itself part of this movement, exactly like you say, and I totally agree. And where I would disagree is that I don't think that there is a productive use of it to be found in like the right allocation of academic and intellectual resources in the right kind of Marxism that should be embodied within these institutions, where I see these institutions themselves as being part of this very structure. And for me, it's more of a bottom up, not a top down approach. If we're thinking about it, if I'm applying a very, very not very rigorous kind of hierarchical formula to academic knowledge, it's more of a bottom up approach in thinking about how people and their like actual lived experiences resonate with one another. And it is from there that they come up and imagine and enact their own struggles, which is for me like one of the most important things in how I've been imagining this. Because some of the challenges that we confront too. And it's like, this is a totally separate point, is that when we try to imagine, or at least for myself and thinking through this movement, is like when we try to use language that has been just so like, um, denigrated by the media class and by the political class, words like socialism and Stalin and stuff, even though I'm like very much trying to employ a Stalinist approach to hierarchy in these ways, we run into these problems that I'm like, I wonder, this is more of a curious question for you, is like, how do we then move the needle on trying to motivate these kinds of social changes when these terms have just been so demonized, historically, where, you say these terms and try to employ like an actual communist movement forward, and it's like immediately, shut out, or people are like, scary, communism or whatever, scary Stalin or whatever, which is like totally side thing from what I was saying before, and something I'm just curious about that maybe we can take up later.
Jyoti, should I go ahead and reply, or I also don't want to keep you out of the conversation if you want to
No,
direct it
no,
in
no,
particular
no.
directions.
Just go on, and when you end, then I have other.
Okay.
If you
W-
think we can move to a different segment, I'm very happy to do that as well.
Well, maybe I'll just say
Have
say
a
one thing, or maybe two things really quickly. One is that with the like I'm not preoccupied with the role of academics and how they might be able to contribute to imaginary post-capitalist futures. I'm primarily interested in how intellectuals, qua workers, can contribute to very real class struggles in the here and now and the actual future that is post-socialist, which is already being built. And so, in that regard, I don't see myself or the people that I admire fetishizing Marx as a kind of academic thinker or something like that. I mean, Marx wasn't an academic. I mean, he was supported for a number, decades in the British Library by Engels, who was working because they had an arrangement in order to do that. He was chased out of numerous countries. He was in political exile. And so it's a very different situation. Regarding his positions on the colonial question, Marx was a thinker who is evolving. And we need a materialist and dialectical analysis of his evolution. And by the late 1850s, his position on the colonial question and on history in general broke with the kind of cosmopolitan version that you cited in his writings on India, in which there would be a kind of capitalist evolution that would then bring about an eventual socialist transformation, and instead began to identify, you see this clearly in his writings on Ireland, the colonial question is really at the heart of the struggle against capitalism. And in that regard, he then, and you see this as well in his later writings on Russia, he saw that there were multiple paths towards socialism and the possibility that socialism would come from what we currently refer to as the global South. And so that's one general statement. And I do think that, well, there's more that could be said about that. The other thing is, I thought I would just respond to the Foucault t-shirt if I can, because it's interesting that Foucault has been so heavily commodified. And in many ways, that's the way in which he has been promoted within the imperial core. And one of the reasons for his commodification is precisely because he embodies a kind of Nietzschean and Heideggerian inspired radicality, right? Think a little bit about these two figures. Nietzsche was a radical aristocrat who was absolutely hostile to all forms of people power and against, what he called the herd and mass in general. And Heidegger was an unrepentant Nazi. And so if you are in post-World War II France that had been liberated from Nazism due principally to the Soviet Union defeating the Nazis in the East, and in the wake of World War II, you're rehabilitating Nietzsche and Heidegger as radicals, then what side are you on? And most people, of course, recognize this. If you read all of the biographies of Foucault, he referred to himself as a anti-communiste primaire, so almost a primitive or primary anti-communist. And as I mentioned before, he was involved directly with destabilization campaigns against Poland and oversaw, in fact, a fund that was to support Solidarność in Poland. Solidarność in its very early phases was driven by some of a workers' movement and a desire to reform socialism within Poland, but very quickly became hijacked, and the principal funder of Solidarność became the CIA. And the fund that Foucault was overseeing in France almost certainly had CI funds that were channeled through it. And he also then made solidarity trips to Poland, supported the dissident movement. It became his principal political cause in a lot of his later work. And he worked hand in glove with André Glucksmann, who was the leading figure of anti-communist destabilization campaigns in France at that point in time. And so he's in many ways just a rank anti-communist. And he's someone who ignored entirely, with very, very few exceptions, the colonial question. And of course, Edward Said and many others have called him out on this. Angela Davis has, Joy James, and many others as well. And so he's the epitome of the type of figure who is a faux radical whose intellectual roots are in Nazism and anti-socialist kind of aristocratic radicalism a la Nietzsche. And in that regard, the idea that he would have something to contribute to contemporary struggles, I think, is quite far-fetched, to put it simply, unless those struggles are the struggles for the rehabilitation of fascism, a shoring up of, in the case of France, he was a Gaullist for a long time, so a shoring up of a kind of Gaullist politics. So those are just the two things that I wanted to add, but I'll give it back to you, Jyotish.
Yeah, I guess one of the things for me to just pitch in here, and this will not disrupt the conversation. It would be a way to let David respond to what Professor Rockhill said, but also I'm adding a couple of things, given both Professor Rockhill and David are focusing on how radical praxis should be placed at the center, how social movements and radical praxis at the bottom should be the center, and what's the role of intellectuals in there. And my question here for David is, my exposure to Marxism never came from university. Of course, when I went to university, my exposure to Foucault, Deleuze, and others came in university because it is where these names are dropped. But my exposure to Marxism came when I was working as an engineer, and I got in touch with trade unionists, and I was trying to organize informal labor in the city of Calcutta. And there people were talking about wages, there people were talking about not being fired, there people were talking about work conditions. And in that, Marxism had a very central role. I mean, it's of course not the kind of role of Marxism that we see in universities, but nevertheless, Marxism was always there. And I think a point of difference here with Marxism as opposed to the others are whether it's actual revolutions in China and Russia and Cuba and elsewhere, or whether it's these deep traditions of near revolutions in places like India. So you find among Adivasis, most of whom in India could never read and write, but in their celebrations against imperialism, against police state, and so on, there would always be Marx and Lenin as a metaphor at the very least. But if you go to the farmers' protest, I visited the Indian farmers' protest, which lasted for more than 7 months. The trade unions were at the centers of these organizations, the trade unions and the farmers' organizations, and they would write several pamphlets and banners and songs, and in all that, of course, they were addressed to the immediate realities. So in the farmers' protest, they were addressed to the question of land, they were addressed to the question of corporations and so on. But in there, you find the Marxist tradition. I haven't personally found an equivalent tradition of the French theory and post. I have found that in universities, and where there is always this name droppings, and it brings us back to the exchange value question that Professor Rockhill said. Would you agree with my observations? And if not, can you name some social movements and contemporary examples where you think that French theories and postmodernists and post-structuralists have their own organizations that inform their praxis?
No. This is why they're ultimately reactionary. I mean, this is like it's like you're saying that water is wet. Yeah, I don't know what else there is to like say about it beyond that. I mean, these are ideas that are grounded in the same kind of individualism that they claim to criticize and to challenge. And this is exactly what like Spivak says about Deleuze and Foucault when how she starts out this Can the Subaltern Speak? She's like, Deleuze and Foucault don't give us anything in terms of actually thinking through like post-colonial transformations. Like they don't. They give us templates for like individuals, i.e., European imperial core type individuals to like better themselves. That's like essentially what we find within these doctrines. Now, with that being said, is it like totally useless? Obviously, I don't think so. Is it going to be the galvanizing factor to like motivating collective change? I also don't think that. But for me, the barometer, the metric for some kind of idea's value is not necessarily found in what it's going to motivate in terms of collective action. Now, one anecdote, to illustrate this, when I used to work with the Democratic Socialists of America, they quickly became intolerant to me because they were not fond of the fact that I, inspired by Foucault, was a little bit concerned about the rate of policing and incarceration in Cuba. Now, this was totally inspired by a desire to push the communist needle in very important directions, while also being a little bit cautious and at least taking some of what I found to be important insights out of Foucault to question the carceral system and to question the nature of policing and the nature of imprisonment and how these institutions work within the very constructions of this idea of the individual that I think are really important to take into account as like informative supplements to what I center as like a communist transformation. And that's for me the like really important element of these movements. Now, with that being said, I think that we're setting our sights obviously on French theory. That's our focus here. But we find other similar things in some of the other movements or some of the other theoretical domains that Gabriel had mentioned earlier, like Afro-pessimism or other things that are, just kind of reductively assigned the title of identity politics or whatever. Because Marxism is not the only theoretical tradition that has inspired collective social movements. I mean, we could just look at the history of critical race theory as being instrumental in a lot of ways in motivating challenges against white supremacy and anti-Black racism in the feminist movement, in providing what is really important theoretical contributions, which are not reduced to them. And I want to stress that. I'm not in any way, shape, or form suggesting that feminism owes its gratitude to academia. But these have nevertheless still played a part in motivating these movements, which again, I know that that's not the focus of what we're getting at today, but Marxism does not hold a monopoly on these kinds of movements, which is again, I mean, one of the lingering things for me is like, I still don't think that Marxism is a settled science. I mean, we haven't really even talked about Marxism, but if we got into the nitty-gritty about what Marx is actually offering across his work and what this project looks like, I think that we struggle to find like a complete alignment in our views. And the same with many other Marxists, but essentially that's what I wanted to highlight.
Professor Rockhill, if I can just stress a couple of things. What about the police systems in Marxist states? How do we critique as Marxist these institutions, as David rightly raised? And what do you make of other forms of struggles and oppressions? I mean, you briefly spoke about the social reproduction questions, but on questions of race, on questions of gender, sexualities, even media culture, is Marxist framework adequate in itself, or what's your response to that?
Yeah, I would say, well, maybe perhaps first and foremost, just to pick up on what David was saying about Marxism and the question of whether or not it's a settled science. I think that Marxism is a process of learning that is collectively resourced, meaning that I would ultimately just refer to it as dialectical and historical materialism, a collective science. Marx happens to be, what Darwin was to evolutionary biology, Marx is to dialectical and historical materialism. He's not a genius who invented everything or saw into the future or predicted how history would play out, although he did make some predictions that are remarkably tight compared to other figures in the 19th century. But he's one of the founding figures within this tradition. And if we look at it from the point of view of the primacy of practice, the theoretical and practical tradition that has leveraged power away from the global history of imperialism has been Marxism. What other tradition has literally built up socialist states as impediments to the imperialist project? Anarchism hasn't done that. Post-Marxism certainly hasn't done that. All of the academic fads that we're talking about have not done that. So if we're looking from the point of view of the primacy of practice, you'd have to give an analysis of why there were other theories that made such a powerful contribution. I mean, what was it? Almost, depending on the stats that one looks like, I mean, we were getting close to 2/5 of the world's population living under socialist governments. There's no other philosophy that gave birth to such a global movement of liberation from imperialism. The question regarding the police system.
Just to rehash, I think in my mind at least, on the anti-imperialist question and the class struggle question, the jury is very clear, at least to my mind. It's the Marxist tradition that has been, if at all, has been central to these praxis. But what about the question of race and question of sexualities and other forms of oppression?
Yeah, for sure. Very quickly on the police question, first and foremost, I think that there's a kind of anarchist approach that consists in saying that we should just abolish the prison, abolish the police, abolish the state, abolish everything, which is I mean, it's very idealist, because in the world in which we live, for socialism to exist, it has only existed under imperialist siege, meaning that you need a people's army to defend it, otherwise it's going to be crushed. And so taking an anarchist line of having a socialist country and then abolishing the penal system and abolishing the police and abolishing the state is basically opening yourself up for imperialist destabilization. It's precisely what Horkheimer said that the Soviet Union should do in the 1940s when the Nazis were marching east. They should get rid of their state. Like, what world do you live in other than a reactionary counter-revolutionary world? Now, within those systems, then, there is a state that functions in a very different way. And the penal system in Cuba, or the police system in Cuba, it's a people's state. The state is not in the hands of the bourgeoisie. It's in the hands of a political party as a stand-in for the general, as the embodiment, I should say, of people's struggles. In that regard, what they are doing is trying to preserve their own sovereignty. And that's very different than a penal system that is engaged in class warfare on the racialized working class, principally, as it is in the case of the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that one can't have coherent criticisms of certain forms of incarceration or of policing, etc. But I think that one has to have a coherent delimitation between a people state and a capitalist state, and that those function in very, very different ways. On the front of race, gender, sexuality, I think that someone like Domenico Losordo has demonstrated this, I think, better than most, and that is that the Marxist tradition has always been dedicated, I should say the best elements of the Marxist tradition, because in any case, this is a tradition in which it's a collective process of learning, but there's push and pull and struggle within it. The best elements have always been dedicated not only to the overcoming of exploitation, but also to the fight against all forms of oppression of women, of national groups, of racialized groups, etc. And that the long history of Marxism demonstrates that very, very clearly. I mean, Valentin Mogadam has shown in her work that the Russian Revolution constituted the most radical transformation of gender relations, arguably in the history of humanity, because women were not only empowered, but the forms of labor that were imposed upon women, mainly through domestic slavery, were taken over by the state, because the state took it upon itself to set up forms of childcare, canteens so that the workers could be fed, so that cleaning crews that would go through and clean houses, so that this wasn't imposed as it is within capitalist society upon women. And they also empowered women politically and integrated them into, as they were already part of the revolutionary struggle. This wasn't a seamless process because one of the things that socialism inherits is all of the evils of capitalism. And we have very specific forms of misogyny and patriarchy that are operative under capitalism. We also have the specific modalities of racism that are operative under capitalism. So what socialism has had to do in the real world is inherit all of those setbacks, and it's needed to both re-educate its population and then set up institutions that could radically transform it in a more egalitarian direction. You can't, unfortunately, do that overnight. There have been incredible, incredible gains, but it's not possible to do it immediately. So speaking of Cuba, for instance, Cuba was concerned in the 1960s that the homosexual population was being mistreated due to the history of chauvinism across Cuba, and also the fact that Cuba was used as a central site in the global sex trade prior to 1959. And so there was a lot of homosexuality that was part of that global sex trade that was set up because Cubans were being used as prostitutes, mainly for US business people. And what Cuba decided to do is to try to isolate some of the homosexual community, primarily from military service and things like this. They realized that that was then a mistake because it was fostering other forms of oppression against the LGBTQ community. And when you look at Cuba today, one of the things that they did is they set up the Cenesex, which is an institution that is making incredible contribution to re-educating the society about the need to embrace all lifestyles, queer, trans, etc. And the family code, as most people know, that was done through democratic consultation, is arguably the most progressive family code in the world. And it recognizes the right of all peoples to basically self-declare themselves as a family, regardless of sex, regardless of orientation. And so that is a testament to a socialist project of self-criticism that is really at the vanguard of transforming society to make it much less oppressive. When you compare that to what's going on in the United States right now, for instance, I mean, there's no comparison. So I think that maybe the last thing that I would say is on the front of racial liberation, the history of capitalist racialization has been the history of racializing the groups from the global South that have been the targets of imperialism. We have the primary racial categories that are used, for instance, in the US American world. You have black for the African continent, brown for South America, yellow for the Asian continent, and you have red for the indigenous population, right? And white would be the color that's affiliated with the colonizers. In that regard, the colonized of the world have corresponded to those who have been racialized because the process of racialization is one of trying to justify the colonial project by saying that these are subhumans. They're not fully human. And so the project of liberating the global South through socialist state building projects has been a project of saying very explicitly to the imperialists, we are people too. We can rule ourselves. Read Ho Chi Minh, read Mao, read Thomas Sankara. All of these figures say very clearly that a big part of their project is lifting up the people who have been subhumanized by the long history of imperialism and laying claim to their dignity as people. And so that's core and essential to the dialectical and historical materialist project, particularly in the practical forms that it's taken in the struggle against imperialism.
David.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's difficult to parse through all of that because it's a lot. But some of the things about it that immediately strike me is that I generally wonder about this, even the Marxist interpretation of or thinking through ending sexism, for example, or allocating more resources to liberating women, which obviously has been a central point of Marxist struggle, specifically the movement of like socialist feminists and whatnot, who've done like really important work in those directions. But in any case, like I wonder how much of this, and especially in the way in which it's been figured in these contexts, it has been imagined as though, and if you read, if we just go back to Capital, Volume 1, where Marx writes about essentially like the harm that capitalism has inflicted on women has been that it's taken away their purity or taken away their fragility in favor of putting them in these horrible working conditions, which is like, these conditions are indeed horrible and no one should have to endure them. Here is found like a fundamental tenet of even Marxist understandings about what gender necessarily is. And we find in different contexts, like for example, Oyewumi, you're writing about the Yoruba people who's don't do not necessarily have or did not necessarily have prior to colonialism any ideas about what gender necessarily was. It didn't come to play a part in the distribution of labor or leadership or anything like this. And this is just one of some of the assumptions that underwrite Marxist understandings of the world that I find within Marx itself. Whether or not that's been adapted into new ways, I mean, that's obviously we can talk about that. But in any case, I'm a little bit interested in the way in which there's like this willingness to forgive, like, and to find a lot of room for compassion and grace when it comes to the problems of Marxism or anything like that, as just being like, oh, well, it was a part of a long line of thinking, they were still immature in their thought. But when it comes to like Foucault or whatever, then it was like absolutely intolerable. Anything found there is not acceptable. It's just, totally out it should be thrown out with the bathwater.
But just to interact there, would you be tolerant about a sexist Marxist from the 1960s and 70s? Because the French tradition we are talking about is a very recent nature, but you are going to the 1850s, and whether Marx used the language of femininity or things that we would consider today problematic. So I'm just asking you that question, like, would you be equally forgiving to Marxists whose language would be sexist in from the 1970s?
Uh, Forgiving, like I'm being forgiving to who?
I mean,
Like to Foucault and stuff?
you said there is within the Marxist tradition there is a leniency applied, a more forgiving approach to the assessment of the whole tradition. But when it comes to the French theory and post-structuralism, there is a much more stringent um, examination that has been done. That was your claim, as I understood it.
No,
And
I mean it specifically with what Gabriel had just said about
okay.
when I brought up the question of colonialism of India, that was something that was immediately glossed over when it was essentially resulted in the deaths of millions of Indians and the conquest of that land to enter them to the spectral light of European capitalism. But that was like, oh, we can write that off. It's okay because it was part of Marxist progression as a thinker. And, we find like if we can apply the same kind of grace to the post-structuralists we find in Deleuze, one of the most vocal in among that field, vocal supporters of Palestine, against Zionist genocide and aggression and occupation. And in Foucault, at the end of his life, we see, or toward the end of his life, his views on Iran as being the pretty much a repudiation of American imperialism in so many different ways. And so it's like it's moments like that where I'm like, I wonder how much of this is inspired by an actual like, real consideration of the actual merits of all of these ideas and where they fall short, and instead more of a knee-jerk type of just effort to repudiate anything that doesn't immediately align with the doctrine. And even with my Foucault shirt, which is my I love this shirt. The response to it being like, oh, it's funny how Foucault's been commodified. To which I'm like, Marx hasn't been commodified. You remember Grimes doing the little Marxist photo shoot, the Tesla type photo shoot thing. How many people do I see walking around with shirts of Che Guevara or Marx or something? So I mean, I found that comment to be kind of out of place
Yeah,
and not really
good.
productive.
Maybe Professor Rockhill, if you can quickly respond to that. I mean, Marx in 1853 supported British colonialism. In 1858, he repudiates. But would you apply the same to Foucault or others within a period of 5 years if their opinions changed?
No, I think that the center of one's analysis has to be whether or not someone is advancing towards claims that are more correct and more practically relevant. And in the case of Marx, I have no problem whatsoever saying that no, the earlier position he took was incorrect. And if Foucault had evolved to the point, for instance, of recognizing what Marx did a century earlier, namely that the colonial question had to be at the center of one's analysis of the global capitalist system, then I would be the first person to say, well, thank you, Foucault, for recognizing that. If Foucault had, for instance, evolved beyond his Zionism, because he remained a defender of Israel until the end of his life, then I would have said, thanks, Foucault, great move. I have no problem with that. I am not dedicated to the kind of fetishistic relationship to individual authors that is so prevalent within the imperial theory industry.
And
You
you
have
you you recognize his support of the Iranian Revolution against American imperialism.
He was not clear about it being against American imperialism. In fact, in his writings on Iran, he never once cited the fact that what was going on in Iran, which I think he had a woefully limited understanding of, to say the least, and was taken to task on. He didn't recognize that this was bound up with a U.S. CIA orchestrated coup d'état against a democratically elected government. So in that regard, I think that, Foucault was quite lacking, but Foucault's not he doesn't engage in solid, rigorous materialist analysis. He has a kind of conceptual framing that he imposes on a particular archive that he chooses, and then he pilfers particular elements from that archive that appear to confirm his overall ideological or philosophic framing that he gives. I
Like
think that
what?
regarding the question of commodification, I mean, there are many different forms that commodification has taken. And Marx, Che Guevara, yes, of course, they've been commodified. But what type of practice do we want to invest in? Are we here to just sell things, or are we invested in, and, are we principally invested in exchange value, or are we invested in use value? And granted, the relationship between the two can be quite complex, because to circulate a book like Capital, it has to be part of a capitalist market, at least, in its current forms. And therefore, it does have to have a certain amount of exchange value. These things are more complicated, et cetera. But at the end of the day, what I think is really integral to a lot of the way in which French theory is promoted is that it's promoted for its exchange value, not for its use value. As I think we agree, it doesn't really have any use value for struggles in the real world. It mainly has symbolic value within a certain academic world, within the art world, within the kind of culture of the bourgeois classes, primarily within the imperial core, but due to the way in which intellectual imperialism operates, it's also widespread around the world, at least among the elite there. So I don't know if that's enough, Jyotish, or were
Well,
there particular things that you wanted me to follow up on?
No, I think David wants to respond.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I earlier when we posed the question of the actual applicability of French theory in any of these contexts, I mean, I was, didn't necessarily want to go down this route, but just in Montreal, where I'm from and what I consider home, there's a vast anti-carceral movement that is inspired by Foucault. I mean, it's very much bound to much of Foucault's ideas. I mean, there's a really great book. It's like Foucault à Montréal, which looks at the ways in which that Foucault's ideas inspired specifically when Foucault was giving lectures in Montreal. So I mean, as just like a matter of fact, there are these actual movements that are inspired by this. Whether or not they're worthy movements, I mean, I think so. But for me, the be all end all of the application of academic thought is not found in how its approximation to one specific struggle, that is the class struggle, even though that for me is primary. I mean, that is obviously the most important. I see these things rather working together. I mean, I was in a meeting with Yanis Varoufakis the other day, and he just said this exact same thing. I mean, for him, it's extremely important whether or not he's actually an exemplary revolutionary figure. We can question. But one of the things that he said was the necessity of taking into consideration both the class dimension, the race dimension, the gender dimension, and so on to analyze these things. And I think that it's incredibly reductive to suggest as though there wasn't even among these other theoretical traditions within French theory or whatever, that they didn't at all inspire any kind of movements or are not found on the ground. And again, I say this fully knowing the limitations of these ideas, how they are just so inaccessible, and hence what the important work that, I mean, you're doing with like critical theory workshop and with India and the global left. And what I'm trying to do is to make these ideas accessible in ways that allow people to see how they can really work together. Like I see that Foucault and Marx to be incredibly compatible, while I also acknowledge and I'm fully aware about Foucault's views of Marxism and communism. Like, and these things I can hold to be true at the exact same time. I think Foucault gives us some very good insight into the nature of power that should be accounted for, at least in part, when thinking about revolutionary movements and thinking about the way in which surveillance mechanisms limit people's potential. And what some of the ways that I think about, want to think about, for example, the race dimension or the gender dimension, is that the oppression of women, it predates capitalism. It predates capitalism and it exists outside of the structures that Marx was focused on, which isn't to say that we cannot reduce sexism to capitalism. Absolutely, capitalism thrives on the continued oppression and exploitation of women and women's bodies. Like this is fundamental to understanding capitalism's role here. Is it the only factor? I mean, for example, one of Foucault's really important insights is the way in which like the church and capitalism work together, and the church being a kind of antecedent to or coming before capitalist production was itself like a really interesting motivating factor for the crystallization of the capitalist mode of production and all of its attending exploitative circumstances. We find the same thing in like Max Weber and stuff. And again, Max Weber, certainly not a revolutionary, but these insights are nevertheless important for me, in shaping what is a revolutionary praxis that is able to take all of these things into consideration, as many things as possible, because I don't see more ideas corrupting the movement. I see more ideas helping the movement flourish and to take into account the wide range of experiences that have affected people, while trying as best as I can and we can to see through the ways in which even divisions have not necessarily, or they're not necessarily grounded in reality, but instead are the product of capitalist exploitation itself, product of media industry, product of identity politics, and everything like this.
I think we are getting towards the end, and I want to ask Professor Rockhill one final question, and then end the conversation by asking David one final question. And feel free to respond very briefly if you like. But my question to you would be uh, precisely what David asked at the end, that he thinks more ideas are not limiting, but it's enriching. But from what I have read and heard you, is that some ideas are incompatible, some ideas are built in opposition to others, and you cannot make a mismatch of those ideas. So if you could have your closing comments on whether there can be whether you think there can be a healthy mixture, if you like, of the dialectical historical materialist tradition you subscribe to, and the others that we have discussed today.
Yeah, I think that the position that David has taken is the epitome of a kind of bourgeois intellectual eclecticism. You take a little bit of this, you take a little bit of that, you combine it all, and at the end of the day, science doesn't really exist. So it can be a mishmash of different opinions, different perspectives, etc. And the problem with this particular approach is, on the one hand, that it throws science out, because then you wouldn't have the ability to distinguish between a valid point of view and one that is incorrect. It also is politically questionable, because if you're a true eclectic, and Foucault certainly was, then fascist views, genocidal views, Zionist views are just as good as Marxist views, as revolutionary views. In fact, counter-revolutionary views should be combined with revolutionary views, because it enriches us in this kind of democratic eclecticism of the bourgeois intellectual sort, if you will. So I'm against eclecticism. I do think that one should read broadly, one should inform oneself, explore different perspectives, etc. But at the same time, you shouldn't get lost in the eclectic morass. You should be able to delimit between what is correct and what is incorrect, what is accurate and what is inaccurate, what is fascist and what is not fascist. And that, I think, is integral to a theoretical practice that actually wants to make a contribution, a meaningful contribution to transforming the world in a more egalitarian and sustainable direction. The other thing that I would say is that I don't think that it makes sense to demarcate class from race and gender in the way that liberal ideology and identity politics often does, because class doesn't exist. It is a relation. And therefore, we can't think of class in terms of some substance that would exist somewhere in the world. It is purely relational. And therefore, class is dialectical through and through. And race does not exist as a reality that has been proven scientifically in the world. Gender doesn't exist as a thing in the world. What these are their ideologies that try to reify themselves and pass themselves off as realities. And class, gender, race are all relationally constituted. That's why ultimately it makes perfect sense, as the dialectical and historical materialist tradition has theorized them, to understand them as class relations in the plural. Because then you really go to the heart of where these racial and gender ideologies come from and how to change them. If you only think of them ideologically and you think in terms of the kind of various forms of oppression that are operative, and you don't drill down into the social relations of production that have super exploited the racialized groups from the global south and that have subjected women to forms of domestic slavery, then you're not getting to the heart of the issue, and you're not grappling with the very hard material reality that needs to be transformed if one is serious about changing gender relations and racial relations. So it's far from me to be, what is kind of stigmatized as a class reductionist or something like that, because there is no class to reduce things to. Class is a relation like gender, like race. Therefore, the thing to do is to really understand how they all are dialectically enmeshed within material reality in order to best transform them. And the final thing that I'd say is, in order to do that, you can't just eclectically take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and combine it in some type of postmodern hodgepodge that might lead to, some social movements are attached to fascist ideas, to religious superstition. Then why wouldn't they be attached to someone like an anti-communist French theorist like Foucault? There's nothing surprising about that. And I'm very familiar with these types of movements that are usually anarchist in nature. If all of that, if that type of overall eclectic framework ultimately needs to be rejected in the name of science, because it's science that allows us to clearly understand how the world works as best as we can, not in an objectivist sense, but we can apprehend it as best as we possibly can. And if we do that, then we're much better placed to be able to transform it. If we don't do that, and we say, well, there's just multiple perspectives, then we're living on shifting sands, and we can't actually get a grip on the reality that we need to transform.
David, you deserve a response.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm kind of surprised that it came down to that, in that there's an effort to transform a reality while at the same time acknowledging that some of the things we've been talking about, including class, which is surprising to me, isn't real. In fact, it's only relational, as you say. I find that to be very interesting, and it seems to be to actually
I didn't say it wasn't
with...
real. I said it wasn't a substance. It is a relation. I mean, Marx says it again and again and again. I mean, it's like the basis of capital.
Well, if Marx said it then that must make it true.
No, that's not. I'm just saying that is the Marxist understanding of what class is. It's not a substance, it's a relation. And yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, this is, and we didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of Marx here, but we find the same kind of thing in the very distinction between use value and exchange value that Gabriel alluded to earlier as being kind of a tenuous distinction, one that's, once you actually apply any amount of rigor to it, we find it to be actually kind of tricky to distinguish, where we kind of naively deploy terms like use value as though we're supposed to know what that means, when even Marx was not totally settled on this. When we get to the final volume of Capital, or at least volume 3, not the theories of a surplus value, Marx revitalizes a question that is found in Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and that is the question, what is value? where Marx kind of toys with this idea at the end of volume 3, where he's like, if we follow this line of argument down the whole way and we think about the question of value and use value, what we arrive at is this idea that value is, it's found in the actual labor theory of value from the political economists, which Marx finds to be totally unsatisfactory given the way in which it just naively offers use value, or sorry, labor value and labor power as being the determinant of value. And David Ricardo correctly pointed this out, is like, well, what's the value of labor unless it's determined by the products that are required to sustain that labor? And Marx picks us up at the end of volume 3 to be like, indeed, I mean, this does seem to be like kind of a tricky issue here. How do we actually determine the actual value of things and the actual value of use value? Just to lend some credence to what you're saying there, Gabriel, that indeed for Marx, it is a lot more complicated than saying that there's this clearly defined thing called use value that we can apply to other things like class, that there's this neatly defined thing called class. There's this neatly defined thing called gender. There's this neatly defined thing called race. In any case, I think that none of this really amounts to a kind of eclecticism, given the way in which it, like, citing a few different theorists doesn't really amount to very much eclectic thought. But in doing that, I was also a little bit struck that we go from, trying to consider, the race dimension or the gender dimension, and then the next step is to be pro-Zionist or something, which is a little bit striking to me, and I find to be extremely concerning, at least in thinking about these movements and how they can inform Marxist practice. And it only communicates to me that we are
Sorry, David,
guided.
I missed something. Who was pro-Zionist?
No, what you said before about, like, if we're doing this democratic eclecticism or bourgeois democratic eclecticism, what's that to stop us from then being like pro Zionist as being just another perspective here? As though even within this
Yeah.
movement, or at least taking into these things into consideration, they are not themselves also going to employ their own scientific standards for what constitutes oppression and what doesn't. Just because we move beyond the boundaries of Marxist dogma does not mean that we are then open to virtually everything else. That is not what anyone who's advocating for what you call this, bourgeois eclecticism or anything like that. That is not what anyone is advocating for. We know very
Well,
well that there are limits to these ideas.
the T-shirt that you're wearing represents someone who supported Zionism, right? You
Yeah,
know that.
yeah,
So
yeah.
one could look at your T-shirt and say, well, he's a Zionist because he's wearing the T-shirt.
Oh, that would be really horrible if anyone were to conclude that from my wearing a T-shirt, just as it would be equally horrible for someone to conclude from a Marx supporter that they're necessarily for colonialism and imperialism. I think that you'd agree that would be just as absurd, because
Well,
for my own
Foucault
part,
remained a Zionist to the end of his life. Marx didn't. So, I mean, Marx wasn't a Zionist. I mean, Marx became an anti-colonial thinker of the highest sort. So I don't think we can compare those two cases. But I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to point out the discrepancy around eclecticism and the issue of Zionism.
right. So as though considering race and gender then opens the door for Zionism or pro-imperialist efforts, which is a conclusion I'm not in any way prepared to entertain, because it's one that I find to be like incredibly reductive and also just misguided. But in any case, I think that where we find like this very consistent thread, or where we find, I think, a very important common ground, is in this need to center this consideration of class, and need to center the opposition to American imperialism and its proxy battles in Ukraine, in with its friends in Israel, and the continued oppression that is orchestrated at the hands of these movements. But my concern for colonialism also extends to other areas as well. I mean, not to say that I'm particularly versed on everything like this. I extend the same kind of critique of colonialism to the Russian capture of Chechnya, and to the oppression of so many others on Earth. And I think that these are not always reducible to a neat class, imperialist, and Marxist analysis. I think that it's important, and we are beholden to accounting for, and especially taking into consideration, the voices of the people who are oppressed, not going through the filter of academia, which is incredibly reductive, like if we were to do that, but to, like you say, and totally on board, to center the people who are the most affected. And if in those cases it does come down to capitalist exploitation, of course, that is the focus in that moment. If in those moments as well, there's a consideration of patriarchal oppression, that is extremely important as well and should be considered and should be factored in. And it should be something to calculate in terms of the anti-oppressive struggle as it manifests in any given place.
All right, we will stick to time this time to conclude. 1 minute, it's the end of it. Professor Rockhill, 1 minute, and David, 1 minute, and that will be the end. I promise you.
Well, I think that my biggest takeaway from this is that, and David, I say this quite honestly, it seems like your political center of gravity is a dedication to marshaling intellectual tools for social transformation in the direction of, I don't know how you would put this, but a better world. Let's just put it that way. And that center of gravity is something that we both absolutely share. And it seems like the divergence has more to do with what theoretical elements can best contribute to that. And my sense is that, as someone who for decades studied French theory and within the French theoretical framework, that was woefully insufficient. And that the best model is the one that has been developed principally across the global South as a collective process of learning for how to fight imperialism and overcome all of the evils that we've been talking about. And that's an ongoing tradition that I'm happy to try to contribute to in one way, shape, or form. And it seems like on your side, you find it theoretically interesting, but you want to combine it with or also then engage with other theoretical practices that historically have a record of supporting Zionism, supporting imperialism. In the case of Foucault, he was an open imperialist, supporting colonialism in various ways, and really drawing on the fascist tradition, which a lot of French theory comes out of. That's the tradition of Nietzsche and Heidegger. And so that I see as a quite uncomfortable form of eclecticism. But in the interest of, finding common ground, I think the most important common ground is political. And so let's meet on that front and maintain that front. And we can maintain a kind of intellectual disagreement, or at least what I see as more of an eclecticism versus a dedication to scientific orientation for the collective transformation of the world.
That was a wonderful conclusion, I must say. David, you conclude what you drew from this debate or discussion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that it was extremely enlightening. But I think that, as far as understanding the, quote unquote, global South as this homogenous mass of anti-capitalist workers, I think that that is absolutely true. But also to acknowledge the important work that has come out of this global South as being also extremely anti-patriarchal in so many cases, opposing the many kinds of oppressions that these people have confronted in any given context and acknowledging them for what they are and what they have been doing and the important work that they have been doing and the important work that they have been doing in like elucidating the various ways in which oppression manifests. It is not just one singular homogeneous form, even if we can very much acknowledge the absolute horrors of capital and the need to oppose it and to very quickly, given the status of the world, ecologically, geopolitically, and we could, insert any other existential threat here. But with this, it's about, for me, exactly like Gabriel says, I very much proudly take on the mantle and the identity of trying to factor in as many things as I can in motivating and pushing for this better world.
We'll leave it there, Professor Gabriel Rockhill and Assistant Professor David Guignion. Thank you so much for doing this. And we really hope this is the beginning of such a, beginning of a conversation between people who have the same political motivation to see a just society, but maybe have difference in figuring out which theories are helpful in taking us towards that praxis. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. The last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.